My name is Rehana Hirji Khalfan. I'll be your host for the session today. I work as the National Director at Race and Disability Canada, which is a project of DEEN Support Services. This means that Rabia is actually my boss. So if I end up giving her a little bit more time through the conversation, you know why. I'm totally joking, Ingrid. You know I have your back. So for context, I am a racialized, visibly Muslim woman wearing a pink hijab with a black and white keffiyeh over my right shoulder, which I wear in solidarity with the people of Palestine. I am a mum to 3 daughters. I live in Mississauga, Ontario, and I have advocated in and around the realm of disability justice and human rights for over 15 years now, with experience working with racialized communities, working in academia, and now working in an organizational capacity as well. In terms of the program for today, so we'll begin with a land acknowledgement where I'll try my best to kind of connect the past to the current reality. I'll do a couple of formal introductions to Ingrid and Rabia, and then we'll kind of jump into the discussion on the research that we did with Realize Canada, or for Realize Canada, on the intersections of faith, disability, and race. And then we'll end the session with a bit of an overview of Race and Disability Canada's IDEA project. And then we'll open up the floor if we have time for any questions or comments. So I will begin with the land acknowledgement. So as the organization hosting this event today, Race and Disability Canada recognizes the enduring legacy of colonization and oppression experienced by Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut. Our team live and work on many traditional territories, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which is where I live and work. This acknowledgement is a reminder that our efforts to address the intersections of race and disability is deeply connected with Indigenous solidarity. We recognize that Indigenous peoples with disabilities experience disproportionately high rates of discrimination and marginalization, and that we are committed to working in unity for Indigenous rights in Canada and beyond. With this acknowledgement, I'd like to bring our collective attention to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and their statement earlier this year. The UNCRPD committee spoke about the occupation and genocide in Gaza, in Palestine, the horrific impact that it's having on people with existing disabilities, and according to Human Rights Watch, the unprecedented levels of disablement that is currently being caused by the bombing, forced displacement, and starvation of Palestinian children in particular. Now, as a group who is gathered here today to understand the intersections of race and disability, it would be unconscionable not to connect the past wrongs of colonization and oppression of Indigenous peoples in Canada, which has actually caused the highest rates of disablement and disability in Canada today, with the statistic of 1 in 3 Indigenous people living with disabilities, which is a direct link and has a correlation with colonization, occupation, and oppression in Canada. We must connect that kind of history and recognition to the current day example of colonization and genocide that is happening in Palestine that is causing mass disablement. And so our commitment to Indigenous solidarity, our efforts towards truth and reconciliation, and our desire to really learn more about this intersection of race and disability is incomplete if we're not also calling to an end to the genocide, an end to the occupation, and that we should all have a unanimous and resounding call for a free Palestine. So with that said, I will move on and officially introduce our panelists for today. So I'll begin with Ingrid, just to show that I don't favor Rabia. So Ingrid Palmer is the principal IDEAL, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, Leading to Belonging advocate at Realize Canada. As a visually impaired former foster kid, Ingrid has committed her life in service to combating ableism, challenging bias, promoting belonging, driving systemic change, and debunking myths and stereotypes of stigmatized identity. And I know, having worked and talked with Ingrid over the last little while, that bio is just not sufficient to actually cover the amazing work that Ingrid has done and continues to do in this arena and beyond. And I'm really excited that you're joining us today, Ingrid. So I really do appreciate your time. And then we have Rabia. What can I say about Rabia? So Rabia is a systems disruptor dedicated to equity and justice for persons with disabilities, women, and diverse communities. She holds a master's in disability studies from York University and has served on many key government boards, including including Accessibility Standards Canada. Currently, Rabia is the National Director of Disability Without Poverty, the CEO of DEEN Support Services, and the founder of Race and Disability Canada. As a motivational speaker and documentary commentator, Rabia also happens to be a blind mother of 4 adult children, sorry. Your kids are too old to be called young now. So welcome, Rabia. Again, to both of you, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So we'll go right into the conversation. So as I said, we want this conversation to flow as organically and naturally as possible. My role is to kind of prompt some conversations and ask questions where needed, and I will move us along to make sure that we finish our conversation within the time allocated. So the first question is for Ingrid. So Ingrid, if you could please tell us a little bit about the ideal community research that you guys did under Realize Canada, what it is, and why you did it.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Rihanna. And before I launch into the project itself, I'm just going to give a little bit of background about my organization. And so Realize has been around for 25 years, and its pioneering work really concentrated initially on the disabling effects of HIV and its disproportionate impact on marginalized and racialized communities, and through their work in that area, really came to expand into episodic disabilities because of the nature of HIV also being episodic, and that people with disabilities often have multiple conditions that they are having to contend with in their lives. Realize is the leading national organization in Canada working to promote healthy aging, access to appropriate health support, and the full inclusion of people living with episodic disabilities. We routinely conduct community-based research projects, develop reports, policy briefs, and have developed multiple in-depth training courses for employers and government to build their capacity on supporting employees with episodic disabilities. And our ongoing commitments as an organization are to educate the public, to dismantle harmful practices and systems, as well as to empower people with disabilities. And so that comes to the project that we are here to talk about today, which is nestled in a larger project called EPIC. And the aim of the EPIC project was really to increase the capacity of employers and government in Canada to respond effectively to the challenges faced by employees living with episodic disabilities. And we particularly wanted to focus on intersectional folks living with episodic disabilities because there is very little research on us. Disability in general is still really seen as monolithic. A lot of people still really think of it as white, male mobility. And the breadth and diverse experiences and realities of people who are living with chronic and episodic disabilities is just not captured enough in research. So the ideal community consultations was really intentional about partnering with 12 disability serving organizations across Canada to really look at particular diverse intersectional communities and to unsheath those nuanced experiences of disabilities to expand the knowledge, awareness of government and employers to the lived diverse and really nuanced experiences of people living with disabilities. And DEEN and under DEEN, Race and Disability was a really important organization to have included because of the particular intersect of faith and disability, which we thought was really important to include. So over the year of 2023, let me say that really slowly, these 12 different organizations held within their own communities, uh, focus groups, interviews, research into their particular communities to find out what were the experience, what are the barriers, what are the recommendations around employment, securing employment, maintaining employment, and also access to health services. Those 12 organizations then submitted their individual reports, and all 12 of those reports were then rolled up into a larger report, which lives on the Realize website. And I would really encourage folks to access that and to delve into the wealth of information that came out of those 12 reports. And the report that came from, well, I know we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper throughout this conversation, so I won't go into that. But it was a really incredible project for me to be a part of and to be able to read all those reports and to really discover some things that I didn't know about certain communities. And that's why this type of research is really important, because even within the disability community, we don't know enough about each other, much less only mainstream knowing about us. We need to learn more about each other and what particular difficulties are attached to particular identities and what particular discrimination and stigmatization are being experienced by different members of our community, so that we can better stand in solidarity, stand in support, and be aware of the perhaps unconscious ways that we might be participating in that stigmatization and discrimination, so that we can do better and be better as a larger community.
Thank you,
I'll
Ingrid.
stop there.
Thank you. Oh, you're right on time. And I just want to say thanks, and also to point out that as I was involved in the process of doing that research, and I just wanted to note that your support for the organizations and your coaching and mentoring in terms of really thinking deeply about decolonizing our research approaches when we're engaging with our communities was really, really insightful, and really helped us to think outside the box when we engaged with our community members. So I want to open it up now to both you and Rabia in terms of what stood out for you in terms of the substantive outputs or the research findings from on the intersections of faith and disability, and faith and episodic disabilities in particular. Rabia, I'll let you go first. I'll let you go now.
Okay, thank you, Rehana. I appreciated, the leadership, the collaboration, of course, the support from Ingrid. The work that was done on this report was at times quite painful for the team. So I really, really appreciated what emerged as a final report, and recognize that many a times there are things that we know through our lived experience, but we don't know until we start approaching others. One of the surprises for us in this journey was the initial outreach that the team did really did not get the response that they were hoping for. In fact, the reality of the stigma really prevented participation. The language needed to be changed. People do not identify that comfortably as disabled in many Eastern and Southern cultures. In many racialized communities, the stigma is far stronger around disability than we might think in the dominant culture. Once we started to talk about the other side of the disability being the medical aspect, there's always a medical aspect, but we, as you know, those who champion disability rights, operate in disability justice space, like to minimize or resist the medicalization of the disablement. However, we did learn that for grassroots outreach, to ensure that we reach those hard to reach people in the work that's intended, we needed to shift our language. We needed to use the language of medical condition to engage people, to get them to respond. In fact, there was a higher comfort in acknowledging a medical condition than there was with the label of disability. This shouldn't have been a surprise, and yet it was a surprise to those of us who, you know, are in fact racialized people with disabilities, or very comfortable and familiar with that intersectionality. So we, at this point in time, found ourselves, you know, needing to change tactics. And mind you, even government, the Disability Inclusion Action Plan report federally identifies on page 32 that they are unable to reach certain communities, and that includes newcomers and racialized communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important to note, particularly for government and employers, that not everybody, as you said, Rabia, identifies with the term disability. But to also note that regardless of whether or not a person identifies or calls themselves or uses the term disability, that they are protected legally to have accommodations. And this is directly within the Disability Act. And that term episodic disabilities is relatively new for a lot of people, although once they understand what an episodic disability is, many people either identify as having one or knowing someone who has. And so our general understanding, or a standard understanding of disability, is something that is chronic, something that is unchanging, that whose symptoms are just there all the time. But this conventional view of disability is not what is experienced by a lot of people. Many people don't have persistent and unchanging symptoms. They have episodes that ebb and flow, that come and go. They experience periods of wellness followed by periods of limitation, or unwellness. And some of these conditions can include ones like lupus, multiple sclerosis, multiple dystrophy, Parkinson's disease, anxiety, depression. And some of these are conditions that we don't often link with disability, but have disabling components. So as well, PTSD, diabetes, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, migraines, fibromyalgia. That's not, of course, an extensive list, but it's really important that employers and government recognize that conditions that people are living with might not fall under what we traditionally define as disability, but that those conditions are protected by law, that people living with those conditions have the right to be accommodated, the same as people who do identify as having a disability and that fall under what we might more traditionally define as having a disability, such as a mobility disability or visual impairment or blindness or things that we more not easily, but just more typically recognize as disability. And as you indicated, Robbie, it's really important that we expand our understanding and our awareness of how different communities relate or do not relate to the word disability.
And what I would definitely add there, thank you so much, Ingrid, is I will just emphasize symptoms, right? And I've often used this, and that's why I'm saying, like, I kind of knew this and kind of didn't think about it when we were, using the usual disability language that we have become accustomed to, even with our intersectional identities. So I know for a fact, through my lived experience, that my mother will never use language that describes my brother's disabilities, but rather will use language that describes the symptoms, the barriers. Like, for example, my son does not speak. He has seizures. She doesn't say that he has a developmental disability or intellectual disability. And within, her lived experience, if she goes back to, her place of birth and where she grew up, there was no language that gave dignity and respect to somebody who had an intellectual disability, or who had mental illness. The word was a derogatory street term that just said mad or crazy. And that's not a term that she would use to describe her child. So to say her child has a mental illness, or her child has an intellectual disability or developmental disability, is not language that she would use. Or to say her child is disabled, she would say her child does not speak, does not walk, experiences pain, has dental issues, has seizures.
It's so interesting in terms of, the use of language and the ways in which we describe. And I think that what you said, Rabia, in terms of your mom and how she describes your brother's symptoms as opposed to any kind of diagnosis or any type of label is really a really important learning, I think, that we can all take away and think about as we're engaging with different communities, and especially in terms of community outreach and engagement. And that was most definitely one of the first lessons we learned. I remember when we did the outreach and we put out all these lovely looking emails and posts, and we got nothing. And they were like, this makes no sense. And then somebody, one of the team, Pfizer, was saying, let's just put in some of the, like you said, the medical diagnoses, right? Do you have lupus? Do you live with arthritis? And suddenly we put it out, and within, I'm not even joking, within hours, we got responses of people saying, yeah, I have this. Yeah, I have that. I'll be more than happy to talk with you. And I was like, are you kidding? Just spent weeks trying to get people to respond, and with radio silence. And I think this is a really key point of learning for organizations when we're working with diverse communities. So one of the things I wanted to read out, I think, Ingrid, you had mentioned this around knowing your rights and the duty to accommodate. And I wanted just to read out this quote and kind of get your initial reactions. So one of the participants had said, in relation to the right to be accommodated, said, despite knowing their rights, the participant noted, the employer benefits when I can do my job well. Both my employer and I are working towards the same goal. It's mutually beneficial. They're not doing me a favor. So I wanted just to move our conversation to kind of into, how we build an inclusive organization. And oftentimes the conversation lends itself to organizations providing accommodations based on the legal duty to accommodate. But any thoughts on that particular quote?
Absolutely. That is one of the standout comments from this report, and something that has resonated so widely and so strongly from this report. And that's the notion of course, that accommodation is not some favor or something that only benefits the employee receiving the accommodation, that this is mutually beneficial, that the organization benefits when its employees have what they need in order to do their job well and comfortably and safely. So to get rid of this notion of accommodations being some type of special accommodation or something that is only benefits one way. This is something that is beneficial for the organization. Productivity goes up, output goes up. The relationship, the morale, the culture within the workplace benefits positively. And it's really important that organizations take the perspective of seeing, accommodating, and supporting their employees in the ways that they need is something that is good practice, period, uh, for everyone. And that isn't looked upon as something to resist because it's extra work for the organization. And a lot of employees with disabilities come up against resistance. But if employers and HR departments were better at understanding and being aware that accommodation is a positive thing that benefits everyone, the whole organization as a whole, and in every way, the better it is for everyone.
Mhm. And another quote that I wanted to share with you, because this kind of ties it back to the intersections of disability and faith, and how despite that, organizations generally know that, the legal duty to accommodate is mutually beneficial. One of the participants, who was a senior leader in a particular employment context, said this: "People will say the most horrific Islamophobic and racist things thinking I'm not Arab or Muslim. The higher you go up, the more racist it gets, and it comes from the more powerful people, so it's more dangerous." This was also a participant who had mental health disabilities, and because she was privy to conversations about the intersections of race and disability and faith, she knew that she felt that she could not seek accommodations, even though she knew that technically the institution offers this, the organization offers this, it's something that is available, but she knew that the culture was not one that was actually, receptive to honoring people and welcoming people who from diverse backgrounds who also require accommodations based on their disability. But any thoughts on those concepts?
Again, there is a corporate culture. We know there's stigma. We know there's bias, prejudice, discrimination, racism, Islamophobia, all forms of discrimination present. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these conversations. We wouldn't need to invest in tools and resources and research and generate learning opportunities to combat this. So we know within traditional systems and structures, all of this exists. Often it's invisible, but sometimes when you can pass as not necessarily perceived as racialized, not necessarily perceived as Muslim, not necessarily perceived as disabled, you can be privy to office chatter that can be very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that can impact your morale, that can impact your ability to seek out the supports you need, because you know the attitudes that exist. So it becomes very difficult to come out and challenge that, even though you know that you have a right to it, even though that you know that there are policies in place. It's the culture of the environment, the sort of implicit bias that you are aware of that puts you in a very difficult place when you're privy to those conversations. So it's really, really interesting that somebody brought that forward. And that, again, given the nature of their disability, episodic, invisible, can even be further traumatizing and exacerbate the episodes that they have. So really, people are in a rock and a hard place when they can pass.
It also highlights to me like finding more discrimination, as that person indicated, at senior levels really underscores the need for more diverse representation at the executive level. We know that when organizations talk about having improved in their diversity and inclusion, they're usually referring to entry level positions. And there is, you do tend to, in a lot of organizations, find more diversity there. And then as you continue to go up, it still remains largely white. And so it really highlights the need to support racialized representation at higher levels, and also highlights how engrossed stereotypes of certain communities are still really a part of the culture, that people are still expecting that members of particular communities only look a certain way, only speak a certain way, only dress a certain way, etc. And it really shows that gap in understanding of knowledge and that deep-seated prejudice that still really exists. The intersection of disability and faith and spirituality is really not spoken about enough. We're getting better at talking about intersections, but I don't believe that faith is included in there as much as it should. And this audience will know particularly well about the existence of Islamophobia and how persistent and prevalent it is, and we need to continue to include faith in the conversations around intersectionality, so that we are, keeping that in the discussion and keeping that at the forefront of DEI work, because it's very easy for conversations to get compartmentalized, for certain aspects to be deliberately or even unconsciously left out. And so it's really, really important for us to be really intentional about bringing these often left out perspectives and intersections, keeping them into the conversation.
So what does that look like for the two of you in the work that you both do, in the realms that the circles that you not roam in, but the circles that you are engaged in? What does that look like, bringing the conversation about the intersections of faith and disability into the equation? And what does that look like? I mean, we have a number of people in the, listening in today. So I'm wondering about, what are some promising practices or recommendations or practical things that you think our attendees can take away in terms of maybe inviting that conversation or opening up channels of communication that indicate to colleagues and staff and people within the organizations that they're welcome to, bring their full selves, including their faith, into the work that they do.
Did you want to start? Okay, go ahead, Rabia.
Okay, for full disclosure, I'm a little offbeat today because I sat for 10 hours on a train yesterday trying to come from Ottawa to Toronto, and that trip is normally 5 hours, so sorry.
That's okay, no worries.
I'm struggling a little bit with my words, but I often find myself in spaces that can be obviously uncomfortable. I mean, in one odd way, and maybe, Ingrid can echo this sentiment, we're blessed that we don't see, because we don't see the dirty looks people give us. And we just, move on and do our thing without any regard, delay, disruption, because we know what we're doing is right. It feels right. And we just go for it all the way. We know our intentions are right. However, sometimes we pose a question to somebody that makes them very uncomfortable. We make a request that makes them maybe give us a dirty look, wondering like, well, why is she asking too much? So a lot of times I do get that feeling in anything that I do, that if I'm requesting anything around my faith-based identity, that I'm asking too much. My whole history around the work that I've been doing that brought me forward to establish an organization that serves people's, people's disability related needs alongside with their culture and faith. There was such a gap, and I needed to do something about it, and hence came DEEN Support Services. Disabled people have the right to access programs, services, supports that reflect who they are holistically. We constantly have to compromise when we have dietary restrictions as people with disabilities. We constantly have to compromise our accessibility needs on multiple fronts. They're not just limited to our engagement within disability spaces, within dominant culture spaces, within cultural or spiritual spaces. They are very messy in all those spaces. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm.
You are making sense, and I love and appreciate so much with how you started, because a lot of people don't see benefits in being blind or having limited vision, and I tell them all the time, oh, it's so liberating. Like you said, when you don't see anymore, those disparaging looks that you get, it's much easier to just, push forward. So I am definitely thankful for the liberation that I have received,
Yes,
over the
yes,
years
that's the
of
word,
losing my
Ingrid,
vision.
liberation.
Absolutely, those things, because it really hurts, and it can really stop you when you see the looks that people give you at times, and not being able anymore to see those dirty looks and to pay attention to them has been absolutely liberating and freeing. And on your note of you know, uh, what to do, and how, people can be more supportive along those lines, I think is this willingness and openness to close your mouth and to listen, to really actively listen, when, people are approaching you, um, you know, and want to come and to seek accommodations, because part of the reasons why people, as you spoke earlier, Rehanna, you talked about the report, and people knowing their rights but not wanting to take advantage of those rights, and that's because that there exists a lack of belief. Um, even though legislation exists that will actually be performed, because people are experiencing that, where they're getting pushback, where they're not being believed when they are coming forward or wanting to come forward, or they're witnessing other people come forward and seeing what they go through and not having their rights upheld. So the first thing that people can do is actually uphold legislation. Listen to people when they are asking for accommodations for what they need. Receiving people with warmth, with empathy, with curiosity. You don't have to already understand someone's condition. There's no way that you can hold all that knowledge of varied conditions and possible accommodations. But what you can do is receive people with warmth and openness and a willingness to walk alongside them in their journey, to be experiential, to try things, and to be willing to try something else if their needs change or if it doesn't work. What we need is a culture of safety where people feel that they are actually able to access their rights, where they are able to ask for their rights, where they can have hope and belief that those rights will be upheld. And that their accommodation needs, that there will be genuine attempt and relationship in working together to find what can work best. You don't have to have all the answers, but you should be willing to walk alongside your employees, with your coworkers, to mitigate, the gaps that exist, and to support them in the ways that can be done both immediately and working together to see what needs to be put in place in order to support them better. And so those are some of the immediate, no cost, but extremely beneficial things that managers, that organizations can do immediately to start to make a change in that culture and in the comfort of people being able to come forward and to seek what they need in order to do their jobs well.
And
And I
again,
think, go ahead, Renee.
sorry, again, we're talking about relationships, listening, knowing, receiving,
Yes.
sharing, that it doesn't take anything away from you when you listen and support and allow for different needs to be expressed, acknowledged, and supported.
Hmm.
That, I mean, it's the same old song, right? Like we're still talking about the same concept. The dominant culture tends to feel that they need to strip out all culture in order to be accessible, and that's not what racialized people with disabilities, people experiencing, episodic disabilities and having values, beliefs, spiritual, cultural traditions that are not a part of the dominant culture are asking. We're saying make and share space, and that's about, sharing our power
Hmm.
together and allowing for people to bring their whole self into that space. When we limit how much of themselves they can bring, we don't get the best out of them.
That's right.
And if we want the best, we have to allow them to bring their whole self. And for me, something new that I've been talking about, and I might be going off on a tangent, Rihanna, and you can just, cut me right off, is this idea of the same old may not be working. What do I see that's worked in my life? Was I accommodated as a person with a disability? Technically speaking, check off the boxes. Yeah, in my jobs, I might have been accommodated. But was I fully participating? Did I feel I belong?
Hmm.
Was I able to reach my full potential? No.
No.
How did I mitigate this? I mitigated that through my, systems disruption activities, but my social entrepreneurship, creating my own opportunities. So entrepreneurship in terms of, public speaking, becoming a consultant, laying out my terms of what I do and how I do it. Also forming the NGOs that I have, the nonprofits that I'm running from the ground up, supporting me and supporting others equally, given their needs and their disabilities. And that's because we are bringing our lived experience into that space
Hmm.
from its foundation.
I'm so
Mhm.
glad that you brought up entrepreneurship, because that is one thing that came up in one of the other reports, but that was another gap that was identified in terms of disability is that when there are government programs and supports, they don't include entrepreneurship. Even if they're around employment and work in Canada, that there is not enough support and resourcing of entrepreneurs with disabilities. And it's wonderful that Rabia was able to do that, but that's not a pathway for everyone. And then that is a pathway for others. And so we need to expand on how we are resourcing and supporting people with disability. First of all, there's just not enough in terms of our inclusion in the workforce. And second of all, it also needs to include entrepreneurship and the gig economy, and not limit in any way how people with disability want to support themselves and want to participate in the labor market within Canada.
And on that point about the, accessible and inclusive workplaces and kind of thinking, beyond the traditional realms of what is possible. I made a note here about, based on the research, we found that there was a really stark difference between organizations that provided the technical accommodations that are required by law and organizations that were truly accessible and inclusive. So Rabia hinted, I think, to this point where when she's asked for an accommodation based on faith or prayer space or something or dietary requirements, it's kind of responded to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rabia, as a bit of a burden. But if you add the layer of like, I need this accessibility requirement and I need an accessible prayer space at lunchtime, and that lunch needs to be halal, it kind of, the onus or the requirement is on the organization or the institution providing that service or providing that conference or that place of employment to be open and receptive and to be willing to hear feedback from the participants or the employees about what it is that they need in order to, what you guys said earlier, to bring your full selves to that particular place. And so just a note in the quote that I mentioned earlier about the individual knowing that, seeking accommodations is their right and it's mutually beneficial. The same participant said that in lieu of accommodations, that they would use their vacation time, flexible working hours or summer holidays to get the rest that their body needed. And they would push through the pain, push through the exhaustion to get the job done, and then crash when they knew that they had the luxury of time to do so. And this participant or someone with a similar profile, I remember, had told us that they were also concerned that if they asked for the accommodation, it would feed into racist stereotyping of that particular culture that they were part of as being lazy, not hardworking, and so on. So any thoughts on those points?
Well, as someone who was privy to all the reports, I can say that, and because we focused on intersections and had many reports from different racialized communities, I can say that that was a concern right across the board, and that that type of activity, not taking advantage of your actual rights, using vacation time in lieu of receiving medical accommodations or medical time off, was something that was rampant. Pushing oneself through pain, through symptoms, in order to not feel an extra weight of discrimination and stigmatization because of stereotypes around a race, and things like you said about being lazy or not working hard enough or looking for ways out, was something that was really prevalent in many different racialized communities with disabilities, and once again speaks to the culture of an organization. But I wanted to backtrack just a little bit and talk about what you spoke about on the onus of organizations taking on the responsibility of accommodations. That yes, it's for organizations not to rely on their employees coming and saying, this is what I need, but also to be proactive in recognizing that people with disabilities exist, that people have invisible disabilities, and coming with an expectation that you are serving, working alongside with people with disabilities. And so having choices already built in, and something like menus, like, yes, you need to have more choice in accommodating people's dietary requirements, and you shouldn't have to ask. So you need to have
Mhm.
a variety of options available that people can choose from and give themselves what they need without disclosing. Like, we need to be open and make uh, cultures accommodating for disclosure, but we shouldn't have to rely on it at the same time. Organizations have to get better at being flexible, at offering more choices so that people can access what they need and not necessarily have to say, it's because of this, it's because of that. So that might be necessary at times, but it shouldn't be something that we're resting our accommodations on. Organizations also have to be better responsive, but they also have to be proactive and realize that people with disabilities make up a large portion of the demographics in Canada. We are everywhere. And so when you are planning and designing, that you are actively and always considering that we are here, that we will be using this space, and what our needs may be. So I just wanted to add that in there.
And those are based on like basic principles of human rights, equity, and justice. So leveling the playing field, making it all fair, having options available. It's the principle that we have in the accessibility legislation world, right? That if we ensure accessibility, we minimize the need for accommodation. If we
Yes.
utilize universal principles of design physically, and not just in terms of the physical environment, but in terms of the structures, the technology, the policies, we minimize people having to ask for things they need.
Yes. Yes.
They just fit right in because we did it intentionally. Intention is a big part of it. We did it intentionally. We don't expect to eradicate everything. It's not going to happen. We're human, and there's constant change and new things emerging and coming, and we don't know it all. But it comes down to those values and principles that we hold dear. And if we work within the lens of those values and principles, we minimize the need for one-off requests.
Absolutely. So we're not expecting perfection, but absolutely, there will be less a need for accommodation, as Rabia said, when we do our best to expand choice, and when we think universally when we are planning, designing, implementing um, whatever it is, a policy, planning an event, that the broader that we go in our scope, um, the more that we accommodate already.
And what I would underscore here, Ingrid, you mentioned planning an event. A lot of times we think that accommodations are limited. Our accessibility obligations are limited to the duty to accommodate the work and workstation, work environment, people's ability to do their job and function in a workplace. It's also the social dimension. It's
Mhm.
also all that other stuff that happens in a workplace. And that's where, we've already touched on food, right? But it's also, trainings that happen, where team building activities happen, icebreakers happen. We're all guilty for this, by the way, because none of us have found the perfect formula for accessibility around these things. And sometimes, we end up making choices that aren't accessible to us, but work for everybody else. And we're like, yeah, sure, to go, let's do it.
That's true.
So, so
Yeah.
you know, nobody's perfect. we just have to be open and receptive and aware that we don't want to create barriers that make people feel excluded.
Mhm.
As long as
Mhm.
people feel included, you can make all the mistakes in the world and figure it out together.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a
Mhm.
important component, and why Realize added that L for our acronym, inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, leading to belonging, because we found through our research and through our engagement with community that even with the first four principles, inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, that folks were not feeling like they belonged. And so there has to be, as Rabia said, this intention to create spaces where people feel that they can bring their whole selves, that they can be their whole identities, and recognize that disabled people are whole people, that we have other identities, and that some of us have other identities that are also stigmatized. So we're not only facing ableism, we're facing racism, we're facing sexism, we're facing other um stigmatized notions, and all at once, all layered in every space we go, or in certain spaces some parts of us are acceptable and another part isn't, and that part is expected to be submerged, or not addressed, not talked about, and that's uncomfortable. And we can't be our best, as Rabia said earlier, when we have to do that, when we know that some parts of ourselves are not welcome. And so we have to get better at creating spaces that allow folks to bring their whole selves in, and where people feel like they belong, like we can have discussions about things. And then, as Rabia said, we don't have to worry about perfection, because we have that relationship, we have that comfort where we can address things as they come up together. But that belonging piece, that comfort piece, is so, so important. And when it's missing, it renders the other principles moot. It makes them um, not useless, but just not adequate, because that
Mhm.
belonging is really, really important. And it's the glue that holds all of them together and makes it possible for us to work together. Um, in a world that doesn't have to be perfect, but has to be comfortable for us to work out whatever comes up.
And I think, Ingrid, you said this at the I think in your opening state comments, what was about how oftentimes when we think of disability and we think of who are people with disabilities, we're not, generally speaking, people are not imagining people like you, Ingrid, or like you, Rabia, or other people that work in our respective organizations. That it's a very stereotypical notion of who fills that category. And so therefore, that then precludes us from being intentional and deliberate about how we're creating particular spaces. And I think a really, really critical point, Rabia, you had mentioned was about, if people feel included and feel like they belong and feel that they're welcome and feel like they can bring their full selves to the table or to their workplace or to whichever environment they're in, you can make those mistakes as long as there is, good intention, good processes, open communication, and then you'll be able to figure it out. And I think that's a really important point in the work that we do at Race and Disability Canada, and I will speak about this for, in a little while. What we found in our research is that non-racialized disability sector leaders were quite unsure about how to have these conversations and how to navigate the intersections of race, of disability, of culture, of faith, because they weren't sure how to navigate the conversations without causing harm or without offending. And we'll talk about what we've done to address that. But I think that's a really critical component, that, being openly intentional and deliberate and welcoming and inviting and creating deliberate, inclusive spaces will encourage and allow those conversations to take place in an authentic way, and allow people to work together to figure out what the solutions need to look like.
Can I add one thing, Rihanna,
Please, yeah.
that didn't come up, is for us folks who are racialized and living with disabilities, is the fact that we also have to combat the lack of recognition of the fact that we have and disabilities. We still live in a world that sees our symptoms as behavioral. And so this consideration
Mhm.
that this person is actually dealing with a symptom of disability, no, it's put down to behavioral. We're still seen as aggressive, as um, as other components that are untrue, and we are combating these stereotypes of ourselves all the time because of the color of our skin, because of our faith, because of the culture or communities that we hail from, and not being considered that we are living with disabilities and are still being reduced um, to other people's stereotypes and labels of us being aggressive, angry, um,
Mhm.
and all these other really negative connotations. So that's something that is really important to also be aware of, the ways that we are forced, to code switch, to mask, because of fear of being accused of being angry, of being, somehow unappealing, because of
Mhm.
these stereotypes around racialized individuals.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think you and I, Ingrid, have spoken about this before in terms of, as racialized people, there is this undue pressure to perform, because
Yes,
to counteract, consciously or otherwise, many of us do it subconsciously because we've been so conditioned to believe, or we just know that in order to be acceptable to the mainstream, we have to perform, we have to act in a particular way, that we don't have necessarily the luxury of just having a bad day, being grumpy, right? And maybe making a
no,
comment and it being forgiven without, any major recourse. So I think that speaks to,
absolutely.
yeah. And when you add, ableism onto that, there's this concept, right, that we're unpacking at Racist Disability called racist ableism, right? Because it's really trying to connect the two concepts together, and that they're not two separate pieces of the puzzle that kind of work simultaneously. They're very much integrated, right?
Yeah,
And that racist ableism looks different from regular ableism. And I'm sure we'll do more research and share more information about that as
hmm
we unearth that. So I wanted just to kind of not wrap up, but just wanted to just quickly review kind of the key findings from the report that we shared with Realize. So just going back a little bit, is that one of the key findings was that when we engaged with the Muslim community around the concept of episodic disabilities, that people, the language was an issue. So people did not resonate with the term episodic disability. So when we put out the call for participation in the study, it was almost radio silence. When we put out the medical diagnosis, do you live with lupus? Do you have arthritis? Then people responded pretty much immediately because the language resonated. And to Rabia's point, people describe their experiences very differently. Some people will describe symptoms, or what an existence looks like, as opposed to what a particular label is. So this is just a note for the participants or the attendees in this webinar, that when you're engaging with racialized communities or minority communities, think about the language. The language may not be accessible to the communities that you're trying to engage, and may be unfamiliar, and they may have different language. And I'll talk about cultural understandings of disability in a minute too, as part of my wrap up. So just a note around that. Also thinking about the intersections of disability and faith, and how oftentimes, the challenge that people face in accessing accommodations, if you want to access accommodations for your disability, and that's not met with, it's not very, very welcomed, or it's seen as an inconvenience, you add then the layer of seeking accommodations based on faith, it becomes even more difficult, and that leads to feelings of exclusion. And then it really does necessitate, or puts the onus on organizations and institutions to think about not just providing the legal accommodations, but also thinking about how can you make yourselves as an organization, as a group, as a team, as leaders, accessible and deliberately inclusive, so that you welcome those conversations, and you, as Ingrid had said, you reduce the need for people to have to ask, because you've designed and planned your event or your organization in a way that assumes that a diversity of people and perspectives will participate and or exist in the spaces that you are creating. So I want to bring us back now, like that's kind of high level overview of the things that we've spoken about, and talk about, so what are some of the opportunities that organizations can and should take to create more inclusive organizations. So Ingrid, you have the benefit of the diversity of the reports that you got under the Ideal Consultations report research. So do you want to, could you share with us a little bit in terms of what overall do you think organizations should be doing to provide more culturally responsive support? And then Rabia, if you have any specific recommendations around the intersections of racism and ableism and Islamophobia in particular to add to that conversation. So Ingrid, I'll let you go first.
Right. So out of I think every single report highlighted that ongoing and continuous education and training was important, and also to not limit that. So it's really important to broaden the type of trainings that are being brought into organizations. And employees really indicated that when they see their experiences being taught or being disseminated in their organization, that it builds trust, that whether or not they outwardly identify um, as having that particular disability, that they still feel seen and recognized by their organization, that it builds trust knowing that they are um, extending themselves to learn more. So extending themselves to learn more about episodic disabilities, extending themselves to learn more about different intersections. So the intersections of faith, the intersections of different race, of orientation, and really digging into those nuanced experiences is really important. Providing avenues for their employees to inform on new strategic plans, on policies, on the work, having the people most impacted helming those new you know, intentions and projects to be more accommodating is really important, so that the people most impacted are really at the lead of leading those new initiatives. But at the same time, it's a balance of not putting the onus on those groups as well. Being intentional of leadership, really leading the way to show the trajectory of organizations, and they're standing behind policies that support people with disabilities. We have definitely heard that people will not feel empowered to stand behind accommodations if leadership is not actively and intentionally showing that they will be backed, and that this is the way that the organization is going. Coming down hard on any ableist or harmful occurrences that occur. Being really effectively responsive to incidences when they occur will help to build that trust within the organization, that legal ramifications will come into play when harm is occurred, and to be intentional about making sure that repair is also done. Those are some of the things. Let me pause here and here if Rabia has things to add as well, and I could also add more.
And so just to jump in before Rabia, I just wanted to say that like in the report, the some of the recommendations included in our report, it included cultural understandings of disability. So there needs to be an increased awareness of different understandings of disability from different communities and cultures.
Yeah.
Listen to the importance of, and as you've said this already, is listen to lived experiences and culturally and spiritually relevant services and support, and to adopt holistic approaches to care and well-being. So Rabia, I know that these are part of the work that we do already at DEEN, but if you had any other, wanted to expand upon those points or add any other points.
So again, for those of us who are racialized people with disabilities add the layer of Islamophobia, really we face a whole cocktail of things that are often complicated to unpack. And all these things are experienced not just in the workplace, but in any kind of public facing access. Automatically, you add a disability to visibly wearing a hijab, and there are going to be all kinds of triggers, and people will perhaps react to the hijab more than to the disability because it's just so visible. So Islamophobia is really strengthening its ugly head, if I can say that, because of what's depicted in the world, what's happening right now, the death, the destruction, all of that happens globally has a local impact, and plays out in very nasty ways for people. So that then impacts our experiences in accessing services, supports, and opportunities. For me, I would say that today there's a lot of uncertainty, fear, and real fear, a lot of unknowns, and a constantly evolving and almost a volatility of experiences that people are facing. Just because global hostility feeds local hostility, if I can safely say that. And some of this is a huge risk to even express.
And I know that I have spoken in different spaces in the disability context about the risks and the dangers and the fear that a lot of people have talking about what's happening in the world today. I have spoken at the beginning of this session about connecting our commitment to disability justice to what is happening, our commitment to disability justice, our commitment to Indigenous solidarity, our commitment to working towards truth and reconciliation as a result of the legacy, Canada's dark history of occupation, colonization, and genocide, to what is actually happening today in Palestine. And I think it's really, really important to connect those dots, not just in a theoretical concept, but in terms of the real life impact that it has on communities on the ground in Canada, in Mississauga, in Toronto, and wherever it is that we are occupying today. That fear and the anxiety about what is happening and the impact to us locally is very, very real.
It is very real. It impacts how we are served, how we perceive service. The burden is constantly on us in the experience to unpack that experience and identify what's happening to us, and it's very difficult. It's very challenging. It's very draining to constantly have to do that.
Absolutely.
I think the piece that I would add to this is, we as racialized people with disabilities carry this huge burden to constantly have to educate and re-educate people. And that's where, when we do have power ourselves, we need to leverage that power to dismantle barriers so that there can be more accessibility and more opportunity for people to participate and request what they need without feeling the burden and weight of constantly having to ask and prove themselves. Again, rolling back to this work, I really think it comes back to values and identifying those core values that are universal to our human experience that can truly foster greater belonging and inclusion.
So what I wanted to do now is, I think this connects really nicely to the points that you both just made around the heightened level of responsibility and the burden of racialized people with disabilities having to educate and re-educate and inform on top of the the everyday experiences that we have in regards to the intersections of racism and ableism. And so under Race and Disability Canada, our inaugural project is called the IDEA Project: Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. The point of that project is to build the capacity of the disability sector and beyond around the intersections of race and disability. And what we have done in that area in terms of the research is to do some work around understanding the history of disability oppression in Canada. So at the beginning of this session, we spoke about, again, Indigenous solidarity. We mentioned words like colonization and occupation. And we recognize that these concepts, although they are being spoken about quite broadly and more commonly these days, we also know that these are difficult concepts to understand. And sometimes when we say things like, let's decolonize disability, sometimes that resonates with some people, and some people are like, that just went over my head, but it's a common feature. So we know that it's important to name the connection between colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada and beyond, and the impact that it has on disability. But we also need to explain that in a way that makes sense to people and meet them where they're at. So our research has connected those dots between colonization and high rates of disability today within Indigenous communities. We've also looked at the history of the transatlantic slave trade in Canada, and connected that to the existence of the legacy of anti-Black racism and the impact that has on Blackness and disability. Just a shout out to Ashay Community Foundation, who is an organization that deals specifically or addresses research and community services specifically around the intersections of disability and Blackness. So check them out if you're interested. But we've done some work around, we're doing some work to unpack those concepts as well. And then thinking also about the history of immigration law and policy in Canada. So what are the pieces of legislation that were designed to keep certain people out of Canada historically? So the legislation favored Anglo-Saxon able-bodied people, which meant that racialized people who were deemed to be different were not included in the immigration processes in Canada. And that collective history, colonization, enslavement, and immigration law and policy, has a real life impact, or has a real life consequence to the situation of Indigenous Black racialized people with disabilities today. So understanding that history is really, really important. So we've done some of that work in putting together that in our literature review, which will be published in due course. We then did research within the disability sector to really understand what are the issues, what are the challenges that organizations need help and support with. So what we found is, and I've mentioned this already, is that non-racialized disability sector leaders were afraid to talk about race, and afraid or find it difficult or don't have the confidence or do not have the competence to do so. And the reasons for that we can unpack on another day. But really there is a need to provide education, training, support, so that we can develop that confidence and that competence to talk about the intersections of race and disability, such that people can then move their agendas forward, can actually implement policies and processes and actually create those inclusive spaces that we spoke about earlier. We also know that there's a huge lack of information, as both Ingrid and Rabia have alluded to, about the intersections of race and disability. What do the barriers look like? What do those intersections look like? And so we've done a number of things to try and address that, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other part of the research that we've done is with race and disability organizations and what they need in order to prosper, because there are a number of organizations that were founded on the intersections. DEEN Support Services is a good example of that. And, you know, not everyone, different organizations have different needs. So the need for collaboration and support, training and education are all kind of areas that were identified in our research that organizations and individuals are looking for. So just a quick level highlight overview of what we've done. So that was kind of the overview of the research and what we found. And then we developed a number of different initiatives. And the reason why we did that is because we know that no one size does not fit all. Learning about the intersections of race and disability as it applies to organizations and what organizations can and should be doing is not like one PDF document that you can read in 20 minutes and then boom, you're good to go. It's an ongoing lifelong journey. So we have developed the IDEA toolkits. So the IDEA toolkits, which will be in the chat box in a minute, are toolkits that are on our website. They are the beginning of a series of resources that organizational leaders can use, review, and apply. So basically, how do you have courageous conversations in your organizations about the things that you don't typically talk about? How do you have conversations about race? How do you have conversations about faith? How do you have conversations that invite and welcome people to bring their full selves into your workspace? And so the toolkit is designed to help leaders to develop that particular skill. There is a form on the website for the toolkits that will invite you to give us feedback and or set up a meeting with one of our team members to discuss the toolkit and discuss any aspect of that if anybody wants additional support or wants to have a chat about it. We very much welcome your participation and feedback on that. The other thing we developed was, and this is specifically in relation to the finding that disability sector leaders were uncomfortable or not able to talk about race. We developed a leadership kind of learning network. We called it the IDEA Community of Practice, where we had a number of disability sector leaders come together on a monthly basis over a period of 6 months, where they would learn together about these concepts of race, of disability, and how they intersect. Looking at some of the history of disability oppression in Canada, and then really thinking about the practical application. And so stay tuned for more information about other opportunities for leadership development and training. We also have a newsletter, so please do sign up, and that's where you'll get a lot of information hot off the press about when new initiatives are opening up. One live opportunity that's available is the IDEA Practitioners and Professionals Network. So this network is, for IDEA practitioners and professionals who are working in this realm, who want to connect with other colleagues to, share promising practices, engage in some meaningful dialogue and conversation, have access to some professional development opportunities where we talk about, for example, we did a session called The Myth of Neutrality, right? Really unpacking those concepts, and it was, a really good conversation. So that network is open. You can apply to join. The next networking session is on November 13th at 2 p.m. EST. So do check us out on the website and join if you would like to. One of the other things that we have done is the IDEA Leadership Program. Applications for that are actually alive and open. We have a cohort running in Winnipeg and Vancouver, and that is basically a leadership program for Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities. So our research also told us that people wanted training on law and policy, on advocacy, and on basically leadership training. And so we're offering that to community members specifically for people at the intersections of race and disability. So if you have people within your networks that would be interested, please do share that. It's a 4 or 5 session program, and it's brilliant. Our team has done a wonderful job in designing the curriculum and facilitate really great conversations. Couple of other things that we have on the go is the peer networks. Again, recognizing the feedback that we've got from community members is that people want a place to connect and to chat and to network and to share information and resources with other people who have similar lived experiences. And so these peer networks are an informal forum to do that. We have one in the time zones of Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And again, check out the website for the next network opening. as I said earlier, you know, people are often unsure or don't have access to knowledge about what the intersections of race and disability look like. And so we have something called the Storytelling Program, which is basically reels and static posts on our Instagram page, which highlight that people like Rabia, like Ingrid, we interviewed them and we kind of are showcasing comments and really good reflections and some reels about what does disability inclusion look like? What are the intersections look like for you? What are your advice about what organizations should do? And one of the things that Ingrid had said actually that always stands out for me, and we use it in multiple of our programs, is Ingrid had said something to the effect of that words on a policy is not enough, right? It's great to have a nicely decked out policy document that has all these wonderful commitments to equity and inclusion, but words need to be followed by action, and words are just not enough. And so check out our Instagram page because it does have a lot of words of wisdom. And again, it's intended to be an educational resource in an accessible way. And on that note, we took some of the learnings from our research and we have put it into bite-sized Instagram carousels, right? So we've unpacked colonization and disability in a couple of Instagram posts so that this information can be more broadly accessible. Because we know that there's not going to be a lineup of people waiting to like read our research report, even though as wonderful as it will be. But we know that providing information in accessible and plain language ways is the best way to get the information out there and to kind of increase people's understanding about the intersections of race and disability. So lots of work, lots of great information, lots of great opportunities to learn and participate. Please do sign up for our newsletter because again, that is a place where a lot of our information, you'll be updated about what's coming up next. One other project I wanted to mention to you, because it directly connects to the conversation about culture and disability. We're doing research on culture, disability, and inclusion. And this is an innovative and very exciting, almost daunting project that we've embarked on with L'Arche Canada and Humanity Inclusion Canada to do research in 10 global locations to understand different cultural understandings of disability. And we will bring that back home and connect with local diaspora communities to kind of compare and contrast with the intention of developing resources for organizations about a given community so that there are actual tangible tools that you guys can use when you're implementing your projects or trying to engage a particular demographic. A point to note is that, you know, those countries are in the process of being confirmed, but the two countries I wanted to make mention that we have decided that we will do research there is Palestine and Sudan. The reason I mention this is because both Rabia and Ingrid have spoken about there is a huge gap and a huge vacuum of knowledge, of information, not knowledge, of information and of resources talking about the lived experiences of people, racialized people with disabilities who are coming from countries that have been forced into war, who have been displaced, they're coming from a genocide. Their lived experiences are nowhere to be seen in the literature. The community organizations don't know about their needs apart from anecdotal information. So our intention about hyper-focusing or being intentional about focusing in on these two countries, Sudan, who's experiencing a great humanitarian crisis and conflict, as well as Palestine, is to fill that gap and to hopefully provide, amplify the experiences and the voices so that it can inform immigration law and policy, it can inform settlement services, and it can hopefully inform the types of supports for newcomers with disabilities as well, because these are areas in which when people are coming, you know, it's a very different experience when people are coming from war and disaster and displacement, and if they're coming here as an economic migrant, right, with disabilities, that the realities are very different and the supports therefore need to be appropriate. And so I've spoken a lot now, but that's all. I just wanted to share like some of the work that we're doing at Race and Disability Canada and the projects that are ongoing. And I always try to re-emphasize, please do join our newsletter because there's lots of information that comes up there. So I want to now hand it back to Ingrid and Rabia if there are any other comments or thoughts while we open up the chat for questions and answers.
I just want to apologize for my yawning and whatever I look like on the screen to people. I am just exhausted from yesterday's 10-hour train trip. And so sleep deprived, and you couple that with blindness and you have a disaster when it
Oh,
comes
you
to our
I
sleep
feel bad for
patterns.
you.
I'm
Oh,
just so excited about it, particularly about the last project that you just spoke about.
culture,
Oh,
disability, and inclusion. Yeah.
yes, yes, very, very excited. We absolutely need to start closing that gap on research, and so really excited and look forward to watching that unfold and to seeing the end result. So good on you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And one last thing I wanted to also note in terms of a program that we have launching. So we have something called the Community Radio. So it's basically a Race and Disability Canada podcast for Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities to share their skills and talents. So the series features storytelling by people with disabilities, sharing their lived experiences, their hopes for the future around disability justice. So again, stay tuned for the launch of that coming up in the next couple of weeks. So seeing no questions or comments, I'd like those of you who are in the room to perhaps just share with us on the chat any comments or a word that describes your feeling or your review of this session and the conversation that we've had with Rabia and Ingrid, and any like any final thoughts that you may have. And then I'll hand it back also while we receive those. I'll just hand it back to Ingrid and Rabia for final thoughts. Go ahead, Rabia, you go first.
My final thoughts, just that I'm glad that we are having these conversations, because some of us have been attempting this work since the 90s. You know, before the word got popularized, intersectionality, we were living, experiencing, challenging, fighting, resisting, and talking about it, teaching about it, without calling it as such. And so I'm really grateful that we've come this far and are in fact able to be working on the issues and generating resources and opportunities to grow the knowledge and raise awareness and ensure that we do work toward a more inclusive society. And we are constantly learning ourselves. You know, that's one of the things. We're not experts. We're practitioners. We live it, the reality, and we're bringing that reality to more opportunities to share. But we're also constantly learning. And, you know, one of my more recent learnings was that I need to understand and impact and unpack with somebody further, just to appreciate the extent of it, was I was at the Community Food Centers Canada Food Summit a couple of weeks ago. And the MC talked about how they don't use the term truth and reconciliation, that in fact that's a colonizer term. They are talking about Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous solidarity, not truth and reconciliation.
Sorry, what was that last part? Indigenous sovereignty and
Solidarity.
solidarity. Okay. And that's just another example of how you know how movements, for lack of a better word, are fluid and changing, and the language of it even develops and changes all the time. And that's why it's important for us to always be engaging in important conversations like this, so that, you know, we're not left behind.
Okay,
So
on
that
that
we
language note, I have to. You triggered me, Ingrid. You triggered me, okay? Please talk about equity seeking, equity demanding, and not equity deserving?
I usually use the term equity denied.
That too.
Because I feel
There you
like that
go.
also is more appropriate, but it's another, yes, another example of language.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And even myself, I forget sometimes too, like using language around, when we say marginalized, like saying people who have been marginalized, because when we say it one way, it takes away the fact that it was done to.
Mhm.
It was these things were
Yeah.
done to people. So yeah, we're always learning and growing
It's like
together.
the reason why we use the word enslavement in our work as opposed to
Yes.
slavery is to that extent.
Yes, that
Yes.
exactly. So when we are intentional with our language, and particularly when we're talking about discrimination, because too often it's not centered where it belongs. It's not
Mhm.
centered in the with the people who did it. So it's
Yeah.
important for us, and that's because that language was put on us, right? And
Yeah.
so it's important for us to intentionally
I just I
redirect
just
through language, as you said, Rabia. Yeah.
I just realized that, academia, people in positions of power are constantly, pushing the equity deserving language, and it just makes my skin crawl. It really bothers me. So I needed to end it on that note.
Me too. And
No,
there's a comment
I don't
in the
deserve it. I demand it. I
Mm-hmm.
require it. It's
Mm-hmm.
necessary. You didn't give it to me.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's a comment, Rabia, in the Q&A that says, this was so interesting and informative. These resources are excellent. And I feel that we should have offered Rabia a cup of tea. So it's impressive that she still attended today. So thank you, Rabia.
Caffeine doesn't help. Sorry. Thanks for the offer.
You need to go sleep. That's the only thing that is going to help you now.
Yeah. Okay,
Some
well, on
R&R.
that bright note, I just wanted to extend my sincere thanks and appreciation to both you, Ingrid and Rabia, for coming to, especially Rabia, after the 10-hour mission that you had on the train last night. I think that I genuinely believe this was a brilliant conversation, a much needed conversation, and I hope that the participants or the attendees here also appreciated the commentary and the experience and expertise that you both always bring to the table. So on that note, I'll let you both go and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon, and I will connect with you all another time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.